Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on senior housing in Scotland, a development and investment opportunity. I'm really pleased today to be joined by ARCO and the University of Aberdeen to give you an overview on senior housing in Scotland today and to talk about some of the hard truths if we want to get retirement communities correct. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping to go through before we get started. So at the end, there will be a 15-minute question and answer session. You can submit your questions on the right side of Teams. We will try and get through as many questions as possible. If we don't manage to get through everything, we'll make sure to get back to you individually via the email address that you provided. Just to let you know as well, the webinar is being recorded. We will aim to get this out to you in the next couple of days. So if you miss anything, we'll try our best to get it to you. Further to that, we'll also send across the slide deck in this presentation, so that will be covered. Just finally, to talk you through the agenda for today, we've got a presentation from myself and Norman Hutchison for the first 20 minutes, followed by Gareth Lyon, who will then speak more widely about policy and the state of the UK retirement sector, and Lex Cumber will finish off with some hard truths if we want to build the right type of product. So without further ado, let's get started. So next slide, please. So just a little bit of background about myself. I became interested in retirement living during the writing of my master's thesis at the University of Aberdeen. I've since gone on to publish my work in partnership with Norman Hutchison, looking specifically at the supply of senior housing in Scotland, and we are looking to continue our research. Norman will illustrate a little bit more about himself when he starts to present. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of an idea about our business, so we are the Sovereign Group, and our aim is to be the leading authority on retirement living and senior housing in Scotland. And to do that, we focus on four main pillars. So at the top of the tree is research. So we're looking at all forms of senior housing in Scotland with a focus on housing with care. And we are using our research effectively to inform our advice. And that's where the consulting arm of our business kicks in. We work with retirement developers, house builders, and anyone who has an interest in senior living to really illustrate some of the positives of building this type of community, and to help build awareness and deal with all aspects of development and operation. Then we have the government lobbying arm, which at the moment is really, really important. Awareness amongst the public of this type of product is very limited at the moment, but it's also very limited amongst local authorities and wider government level. And that's what we're doing with ARCO. We're seeking to inform and change policy so that we can build more retirement communities for our ageing population. And last but not least, as part of the Sovereign Group, our retail arm, Sovereign Assist, is an app designed for retirement communities to help older people within them maintain their independence, and we essentially identify a lot of the pain points and difficulties with aging and then bring together services like access to a GP 24/7, shopping discounts, a technology assistance line to make life as easy as possible for them. And we're actually about to start with our first retirement development in Scotland in July. Next slide. So our aims. What we want to do is to continue to research in the field. Norman and I are embarking upon our next phase of research, which will be a comparison between New Zealand and Scotland, for reasons I'll illustrate later in this presentation. We want to lobby the Scottish Government so that policy proposals promote the building of more retirement communities. And within the next 10 years, our massive goal is to see at least 10 developers/operators enter the housing with care market in Scotland. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of an outline of the presentation, I'm briefly going to touch upon the background to housing with care in the UK. Norman will then discuss the key findings from our research, and I will then look at defining what housing with care is versus some other examples from other countries, and lastly look at how we can go about changing the industry. Next slide. So I'm going to touch on this very briefly because Gareth, who's speaking later, will go into this in a little bit more detail, but it's important just to contextualise housing with care and how it's evolved in Britain. So the key point here is versus the 1980s, in 2020, we don't really have any mechanism to support people that need a low level of care and support. And that's where housing with care, we believe, can solve this problem. And as I say, Gareth will elaborate more in his slides. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass across to Norman Hutchison now, and he's going to talk you through the current state of the senior housing market and some of our findings during our research.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew, and a good morning to everyone. What I'd like to do is outline the current state of the senior housing market in Scotland, and then report on the research that Andrew and I carried out last year on the supply and demand of senior housing in Scotland. So what does the current stock of senior housing look like? Well, in Scotland, it mainly comprises of residential flats and single-storey dwellings in urban settings. Yes, there are a few retirement villages, but they are very rare. And we can think of Inchmarlow in Aberdeenshire and Auchlochan in South Lanarkshire as excellent examples. There are few developers operating in this specialist retirement sector, and perhaps most notably McCarthy and Stone have around 70% of the market. Of course, we can all see a lot of house building activity as we drive into work or wherever we walk around. We see house building. But what is being built is predominantly family housing, not age-specific housing. And the design of family houses are often not suitable for those with age-related needs. The net result of this is that seniors are having to buy family housing because of a lack of choice with respect to size, design and tenure. And one of the unfortunate outcomes of this is that there are a number of underused bedrooms across Scotland, which is clearly not market efficient. It's important to note that the Scottish Government policy is to pursue independent living in your own home, and that dwellings should be constructed with the elderly in mind so that they can age in place. Next slide, please. In 2020, Andrew and I set about trying to understand the level of demand of senior housing, and we carried out this research in conjunction with the Elderly Accommodation Council, and our paper was published in January this year and is available if anyone wishes a copy. Next slide, please. There is extensive literature on senior housing, predominantly US-based literature, and for brevity I will just pick out two dominant themes in the previous research on senior housing. The first is the debate between age integration and age segregation, with the broad conclusion that some mixture of the two is key for a successful scheme. Although the literature was written in a pre-COVID environment, and of course the issue is much more complicated at present. The second theme surrounded the issue of residential satisfaction among seniors and the differences that emerged between expectation and the reality of their housing, with levels of discontent evident. Key factors that were highlighted to improve residential satisfaction were issues surrounding safety, access to services, transport, the general feel of the local area, and the proximity to friends and family. Next slide, please. As mentioned, our survey was devised in conjunction with the Elderly Accommodation Council and was promoted on their website in the summer of 2020. The survey was aimed at the over 55 population, as we wanted to track how preferences changed across a number of different age bands and we analysed the outcomes in the 55 to 64 bracket, 65 to 74 and 75 plus, and some interesting results emerged from this breakdown in terms of preferences. Next slide, please. We obtained very good information on the supply of senior housing across the regions in Scotland, and our conclusion is that there is senior accommodation for around 5% of the over 65s. Now, while recognising that in estimating demand, our survey was just a sample of the population, we can confidently conclude that demand outstrips supply to some considerable degree. And as the population is ageing, this is a problem which is likely to get worse and not better. Next slide, please. So what are our broad conclusions? First, I think we need to acknowledge and plan for the demographic shift which is occurring. Presently, 23% of the population in Scotland is over 60, but by 2035, this will rise to 30%, and by 2039, 800,000 people will be aged 75 or over, nearly double the number of that age today. There are also striking regional differences in supply across the statutory, voluntary and private sectors. For example, in Dundee, there is supply to satisfy 17% of the over 65s, but in Orkney, this figure is as low as 1%. All told, we believe this is an opportunity for housing developers to fill this gap. Next slide, please. For me, one of the most interesting results from the research was the interest among the over 75s in leasing their senior house rather than buying it. This, I would suggest, is a very rational response given life expectancy and the cost associated with purchase and sale, legal fees, agency costs and stamp duty. There is anecdotal evidence of much angst among families at the capital losses which have occurred during the short occupancy period of a retirement flat before ill health requires a move to a care home, assuming, of course, that there is some liquidity in the market at the time you wish to sell, which is often not the case. Moreover, leasing allows capital from the sale of the previous home to supplement pension income and allow for the cascading of wealth down the generations. Therefore, there is evidence that a percentage of units in any new scheme should be for lease. We think there is a role for Scottish Government to stimulate the senior housing developments, and our final important point is that the design of new developments should be flexible enough to allow for changes in need as the occupier ages and include the latest IT solutions to home living. Back to you, Andrew.
Okay, thanks for that, Norman. So yeah, just one important point to clarify. So our research looked at senior housing, which encompasses everything across the statutory, voluntary and private sector. So essentially all of the things that you see on the table in the current slide. What we're really looking at focusing on is housing with care, as we believe this is the best overall solution. And that is the middle portion of the table, retirement communities. There's a lot of difficulty in terms of defining exactly what housing with care is, because there's so many different definitions for it, including extra care, assisted living, sheltered accommodation in the public sector. Gareth is going to talk a little bit more about that in his slides, in terms of defining exactly what housing with care is. Next slide, please. So this was written at a point when, this year, the Age, Home and Communities strategy for older people's housing in Scotland was due to be renewed. However, having subsequently spoken to the likes of Age Scotland, it's likely that housing to 2040 essentially encapsulates everything to do with housing in Scotland. So there's a bit of murkiness as to whether or not the age home community strategy will be renewed. All will be seen in good time. What we do know is that the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted the need for an alternative to care homes to protect vulnerable older adults in our society, and that's what we're looking to focus on. Next slide, please. So as I touched upon briefly at the beginning of our presentation, we are really interested in focusing on New Zealand versus Scotland, and there's some good reasons for that. Namely, that the population of over 65s is at a very similar level. GDP is very similar. Topographically, they're very similar nations, both island nations, similar landscape, and yet there is a massive disparity between the housing with care market in New Zealand and the housing with care market in Scotland. And we don't think sociologically and fundamentally we're completely different to people who live in New Zealand. And our next piece of research will look into why there is such a disparity and how we can learn lessons from New Zealand that we can apply to Scotland. Next slide, please. Just a couple of other forms of senior housing that loosely fall within, some fall within housing with care, some don't. Intergenerational living is a really interesting concept. In Spain, you have the concept of younger people and older people living together, the younger person benefiting from reduced rent in exchange for doing some community service and helping the older person. And here, indeed, in Britain, we have examples of co-housing, probably most famously older women's co-housing in North London, where a collection of 26 women ranging in ages have come together to help each other stay independent. So whilst not formally having care integrated, still good alternative options for people that perhaps don't want to live in retirement communities. Next slide, please. So in terms of housing with care in Scotland, as Norman has alluded to, there are a couple of key examples, probably the best two being Inchmarlow in Banchory and Auchinleck in South Lanarkshire. We do have probably most recently approval for planning in Musselburgh via Cinnamon Retirement Living. So there are schemes popping up and there are other players entering the market, such as Juniper Residential, who are part of Cruden Homes. But as you can see, I don't have very many examples at the moment to show you, although admittedly some are missing from this list. We need to build more, and this list will hopefully continue to grow in the next 10 years. Next slide, please. So finally, how can we change the industry? So we believe there's three key means of doing this. So research is vital to producing evidence to show local authorities and Scottish Government how these societies can benefit people sociologically, lobbying to make sure that this evidence is seen, and finally consulting to educate developers what the best product is to bring to market. Next slide, please. So one of the key things that no doubt a lot of you will have heard time and time again is the introduction of a new planning use class. So in Scotland, we have C8 and C9, sorry, use class 8 and use class 9. In England, it's class C2 and class C3. So you can either effectively apply for planning as mainstream housing or more in the ilk of planning for a care home. And unfortunately, that doesn't really satisfy what we're trying to do with housing with care. So a clearly defined use class can help sites to be allocated and hopefully get some release from Section 75 obligations in Scotland or Section 106 in England. Next slide, please. Wider education is vitally important. As I've touched upon already, housing with care is somewhat of an unknown quantity amongst government and the wider public. Most people would categorize it in the same category as a care home, and clearly they're trying to do completely different things. A care home at the moment is a place to essentially go and live out the last part of your life, and we want housing with care to be a vibrant community where people are interacting, maintaining their independence, and getting the level of care that they need at different stages of their life. And it's really important to differentiate between the two and educate the public. Next slide, please. So yeah, these are just a few more policy options. I won't delve into these too deeply. We've talked about the use class order. There are other things to increase market liquidity, things like removing transaction tax on dwellings involving the over 70s, the removal of stamp duty land tax when moving, and helping with moving fees, etc. So there's quite a number of things to consider, and I'm sure Gareth and Lex will have some good ideas as well on this. Next slide, please. So finally, what are we doing to implement change? So at the moment, we're working closely with ARCO to try and replicate what they're doing with the Housing with Care Task Force in England, in Scotland. So we're currently speaking with some MPs and trying to gather together other stakeholders to really make our voices heard. Further to this, we're doing things like this event to educate people on what's happening with senior housing in Scotland and distributing our research. So that's all from me. I will pass you across to Gareth.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Hello everyone, just to introduce myself, my name is Gareth Lyon. I'm Head of Policy and Communications at ARCO, the Associated Retirement Community Operators. ARCO is both the representative body and the standard setting body for the housing with care sector in the UK. And Lex will touch later on the importance of our standards and regulatory work, but this is absolutely crucial and overwhelmingly it's because the UK lacks sector-specific regulation and policy for the housing with care sector, or indeed to a great extent for older people's housing in general. And this is definitely one of the things which is holding back the huge potential growth that the sector could achieve over the coming decade. So ARCO, for the moment, has stepped into the breach and is providing a very robust self-regulatory framework for our members. But this isn't a statutory body, this isn't a statutory framework, and it's definitely something the sector needs to help it to achieve its potential. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So as Andrew mentioned earlier on, we are this middle column here. Now, the distinctions between the three broad categories of older people's housing are essential and often obscured in UK policy. From a public policy perspective, all three of these are often lumped into the same bucket, and there's insufficient policy across the board. But and this is reflecting the fact that there are no less than 14 different terms which are used to describe the housing with care sector itself, and you can get on for over 30 describing all three of them. The distinctions here come down to two things. Partly, it is the range of facilities and services which are provided in the different developments and how they operate. So if you take the light blue section here, the retirement housing, this is the largest sector of the three in the UK at the moment, the one that Andrew referred to earlier on. Essentially, this is age-restricted housing, usually in a unit of usually a development about 40 to 60 units, usually found sort of on the edge of a town centre. The facilities are usually somewhat more limited there, but again, this is something that people are rather more familiar with. At the other end of the spectrum, care homes or nursing homes, they provide for people who have a very high level, usually, of care needs, frailty and or dementia, and that necessarily they're providing round-the-clock care. Everyone receives it. People don't tend to have so much their own flats. They're more likely to be in, say, an ensuite room in more of an institutional setting. But the model I want to talk about here, the one that ARCO represents, is what's best known as the retirement community sector, but more accurately known as the housing with care sector. and this is somewhere between the two, and it represents a more intermediate level of care need. So everyone has their own flats, their own apartments, it's self-contained. There is 24-hour staffing on site, usually quite an extensive range of facilities, typically on a larger development, and CQC registered domiciliary care is available. Now, not everyone necessarily receives that care. Typically, on moving in, people are less likely to receive it, but over time, people can have that peace of mind and that security that they know that as they age and as they develop more care needs, they can be provided for. And as a result of this, people moving into retirement communities are much less likely to end up moving into a care home. So it also can play a much more significant role in the wider social care system. If I can move on to the next slide, please. So Andrew mentioned this earlier on as well. Things have changed an awful lot since 1987, and the reason that we're basing things off 1987 is this is when the UK-wide legislation on planning and social care mostly dates to. Now, if you look at the shape of the social care system back then, generally speaking, care homes were incredibly different to how they are now. The level of care needs that you would have in a care home would be much lower, if any. And often if you did start to develop more pronounced care needs, you'd have to move into a nursing home or even into a geriatric hospital when you've got more pronounced care needs. Now, and if you can click, the situation has changed dramatically. So geriatric hospitals have pretty much disappeared as a feature of the UK social care landscape. Nursing homes and care homes have moved considerably up the acuity scale. So we're now seeing the average length of stay that people have in a care home or a nursing home varying between 9 months and 18 months. But what this has done is has left a huge gap has opened up underneath these settings for people who have low or intermediate care needs. And that is where the retirement community sector is starting to develop in the UK and starting to reflect the situation that we are seeing in other countries. Can we move to the next slide, please? Just also to give you some context in terms of what the population is doing and what we're likely to see in terms of demographic demand over the coming decades. This pyramid shows the shape of the shape of the UK population by age. If you can just click to bring the boxes on, and again, this hopefully, well, this should be showing the extent to which the UK population is aging. And actually, whilst we talk about the baby boomers a lot, what we're aware of is the fact that even the oldest baby boomers are just about moving into the age category where we'd expect them to start hitting retirement communities. The average age of a resident in a retirement community is over 75. People tend to move in their 70s, and so we're just seeing the first waves of baby boomers arriving. What we know is there is a huge bulge in this population pyramid coming over the coming decade, and as has already been mentioned, the UK is not building enough retirement housing in general, and especially not enough housing with care. So this is going to become a much more pronounced issue over the coming decade. Next slide, please. And just to put this in international context, as you can see, per head of population, you are a tenth as likely to be able to live in a retirement community in the UK than you can in comparable jurisdictions around the world. So the UK is really lagging behind in terms of this form of provision and the benefits it can bring. Next slide, please. One thing we are quite proud about in the UK, though, is that the sector that does exist actually is pretty well skewed towards the affordable or social ends of the sector. So this is one area where the UK is actually leading the world, in as much as it does tend to be the local authority or housing association run extra care provision that you're most likely to be familiar with, which is fantastic. There's a need for far more of that, of course, as well. Likewise, we have a moderate-sized, high-end, luxury-level retirement community sector in the UK. But where we're really falling behind other countries on is this middle market sector, reflecting people who have more or less an average house price, and that is where we're expecting to see the most growth over the coming decade. Next slide, please. And just to give some sense of the potential growth for this sector, if we look at New Zealand, which, as Andrew said, is a very comparable jurisdiction to Scotland. If you could click, please. 5 of the top 15 developers across the whole country are housing with care operators. These aren't just older people's developers. These are the top 15 developers across the whole country, and 5 of the top 15, including the top 1, are retirement community developers out there. So we can see that even in a well-developed and mature market like New Zealand, there is huge extent for growth. This indicates that the potential that there is for the UK and indeed for Scotland. Next slide, please. Now, ARCO has set out an ambitious vision for where our sector can be by the end of the decade, and this is very much taking into account the projected growth trajectories of our members' pipelines. So roughly, I think this has now risen from 75,000 to 78,000 people across the whole of the UK live in retirement communities. With the ageing population that we've talked about, we know that the sector can achieve provision for 250,000 people by 2030, and this would deliver huge economic benefits to the country as a whole. This would also deliver considerable savings to the wider social care system by keeping people out of care homes and keeping them fit and healthy and independent for longer, and also can release a huge number of houses and bedrooms into the wider housing market, thereby providing benefits for other generations as well. Next slide, please. But what is holding all this back, and I alluded to at the beginning, is the policy void in the UK. So we know that in other jurisdictions around the world, there is sector-specific regulation, which gives both consumers certainty about what it is they're buying. They know exactly what they're getting into, but therefore, by doing that, it also gives developers and investors certainty about what it is they're investing in. And we keep on hearing this message from the major institutional investors in the UK that if the government were able to provide more of a certain public policy context, they would be able to invest considerably more in the sector. And this is definitely what we've seen when there's been some every time there's been an indication that the government is prepared to legislate and regulate in the sector, we have seen a fresh wave of investment. So a few years back, when the Law Commission looked at fees and charges in our sector, as the government indicated it was willing to implement those measures, we saw some very large investments being made by pension funds in the UK in this sector as a result. Next slide, please. Now, the problem we have as a sector is that we don't fit very neatly into any government box. We provide care, and therefore, apologies for using the UK-wide government departments here, but I think it's exactly the same principles apply in Scotland. So we provide care, which is therefore under the jurisdiction of the Department of Health and Social Care. We obviously provide housing and have a number of planning and leasehold issues, which would fall under the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. We speak very directly to the UK's ageing population and the challenges that and opportunities that presents the country as a whole, which is a cross-government priority. We're calling for increased consumer protection and clarity, which is something which relates to business and enterprise. We are calling for regulatory reform, which once again is something which would be a cross-government issue. And there are implications of what we're talking about from a financial and from a benefits perspective, which is things which once again sit in other government departments. And it's because of this fragmented nature of the policy context that we've seen a lack of progress being made, because there's no one government department that owns this issue. And that's why we as a sector have been championing a housing with care task force to bring together these government departments and to make sure that all interested government departments are involved in making decisions and pushing and setting out a very clear joint strategy for how this sector can grow. Next slide, please. And this is something which ARCO has had a great deal has put a great deal of effort into over the last 18 months. We've been briefing sectoral government ministers, we've been engaging with MPs of all parties, and indeed it's something which has showed up very prominently in the COVID pandemic, in as much as last year when the government was trying to direct support and assistance to our sector, they simply had no way of being able to identify the retirement community sector versus adjacent sectors, because there isn't this one definition and because there isn't this one body with responsibility for it. And indeed, this is something that's going to be debated next week in the Houses of Parliament in a Westminster Hall debate. So we have been making this case to central government, and all the indications we've had is that they are listening and they're getting ready to make an announcement in this space. And our view is that by getting a central government task force to drive the policy implementation that we need for this sector, that we will be able to get the progress we need, which will help to unlock significant and long-term institutional investment in this sector. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Right, I'm going to have to rattle through this because time is compressed. So here comes ARCO's view on hard truths in the sector. This is not just gleaned from my own personal experience of more or less 10 years in the sector. I spent time in the US looking at the US retirement living sector, and obviously we as a trade body for the sector spend a lot of time talking to our equivalent entities in other countries around the world, including New Zealand, Australia, America, Canada, etc. So next slide, please. Okay, so what do we do? There's three elements to what we do. Gareth's already referred to the policy and influence work. That's key. We're trying to shape a legislative environment so that we can expand across the UK. The sector, it's standards and compliance. The ARCO Consumer Code is the only current set of standards in the UK for this sector, and it's designed largely around consumer protection, which I'll come back to later on. And last but by no means least, we are a kind of knowledge exchange best practice club. So that in essence are the three things that we do as an organisation. Next slide, please. Here's a smattering of some of our members. We're pretty much an even split between the for-profit and not-for-profit sectors. You can see MHA, who have Ochlochen, and I believe Brio are on there as well. So we have a couple of our members who are operating in Scotland. And you will also notice that we have organisations there who are have institutional funding behind them. Riverstone are funded by Goldman Sachs. Retirement Villages Group are funded by AXA, and Inspired Villages by Legal and General. So there's, interestingly and luckily enough, we get the ear of government, particularly when we come to the table with those three financial entities. Next slide, please. The Consumer Code, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about this. This is the benchmark. Certainly talking to our colleagues in Canada, a similar organisation called ARCO, interestingly enough, the Ontario Retirement Community Associations. Government in Canada just cut and pasted from their consumer code when it was an unregulated sector and stuck it into legislation. So I'm not saying that that's going to happen in the UK. It might do. The work that we've put into the Housing with Care Task Force may see that come to pass. But at the moment, if you're a consumer and you're looking at a retirement community operator with whom you're looking to buy into or rent or whatever the case may be, currently the ARCO approved operator standard is the gold standard. Next slide, please. So what do I hope to do with this presentation? Outline some hard truths. I'm going to maybe challenge some assumptions. Really just so that everybody on the call, some of you may be highly experienced, some of you may be just dipping a toe into the sector, but I just want to, in some very, very broad brushstrokes, if you like, indicate some of the truths. Next slide, please. So, hard truth number one, it's a service offer, not a property transaction. And that was that's a quote directly from the CEO of Ryman Healthcare, who, as you may remember in a previous slide, are the largest house builder in New Zealand, or the largest developer, I should say, in New Zealand. A lot of people in the UK look at it as a property transaction. In our opinion, that's the wrong way to look at it. Yes, property is part of the offer. But as I've said there, if your strategy is predicated on selling real estate, actually all the evidence around the world suggests that long term your business model will struggle. And there's a quote from our chairman, Nick Sanderson, who's CEO of Audley. He said this in a meeting we had last week. I happened to jot it down because I thought it was relevant for today. And his quote is, "We're operators who happen to develop, not developers who happen to operate." And that's quite an interesting way of looking at it. Next slide, please. Okay, so hard truth number 2, and I can speak with a degree of surety about this because I spent a year working for Sherpa, who are a US-based sales enablement platform who've been specializing in this sector for 30 years. They currently have 1,720 retirement communities on their books using their platforms, and the average size of their community is about 220 units. So and that, by the way, accounts for about 10%, 11% of the US sector. So this is based on data. Nobody actually wants retirement living. Strange that it may sound to say that out loud. Want is not the same as need. There's a lot of people who need it, but they don't necessarily want it, if you look at it that way. Moving into a retirement community is a scary prospect. Customers are actually terrified of making that leap. Nobody wants to admit that they can't cope at home anymore. Nobody wants to move out of the family home that they may have lived in for 20, 30 years. Nobody wants to admit to friends that they're struggling, with issues related with aging. And all the data that I've seen, and as I say, it's a data set of well over 3.5 million sales data points in the US, basically points to the fact that in any leads database, only about 5% are actually at the stage where they are ready to make the move. Everyone else is thinking about it, is talking about it, but doing it is a very, very different thing. So the really, when it comes to selling in this sector, the hard truth is you have to sell the change before you sell the community. A slide and glide oven is not going to convince a 75-year-old to move into a property. What you've got to, they've got to sell the concept to themselves. And all the evidence, certainly from here in the UK, is traditional estate agency approach to selling in this sector doesn't work. Next slide, please. Many operators don't consider the value proposition through the eyes of their customers. If you want to really, and again, this is taken from New Zealand. The key to success in this sector is transferring risk away from your customers, not putting the risk onto your customers. Variable costs of any kind are a significant barrier. If you're on a fixed pension, you don't want a variable service charge that may be 20% higher in 5 years' time. Fix the charges the day they move in. Poor resales values are an existential threat to our sector. You may have seen, one of the more famous retirement housing operators were featured in a Times article not that long ago, pointing to a 3 billion hole in the resales value of their property portfolio. If you're buying an apartment for £400,000 and can't sell it for 200, that is going to keep people out of the sector. So in our opinion, the deferred management fee, the exit fee model, is how you mitigate some of these risks. It allows you to transfer risks away from your customers. It allows you to fix costs like service charge. And as I will show you in just a second, it actually takes care of the resales values issue as well, because you can continue to invest in the community. Next slide, please. So here's hard truth number 4. Housing with care achieves higher average sales prices than retirement housing. That speaks for itself. That's Knight Frank data. No more needed to be said about it. It speaks for itself. Next slide, please. Okay, so hard truth number 5. Operationally, you may have to run your day-to-day services, both your care, your restaurants, etc., at break even or even at a loss. It's hard to make money out of those services in retirement communities. Even when you're at 100% occupancy, it's tough. However, if your business model is predicated around deferred management fee models, you can subsidize those services, you can run them at a loss. However, running them at a loss very often attracts more people to the community. And I point to the Life Care Residences community in central London. Their deferred management fee, by the way, is 30%. They take 30% of the value of the property back. But for example, their restaurant is heavily subsidized. So whenever I walk into that community, it's about 90 odd units. The restaurant is packed. And when you look at the restaurant menu, it's basically gastro pub type food. It's always, all the covers are taken every lunchtime, and you can have 3-course meal and a bottle of wine and you get change out of 20 quid. Now they're subsidizing that off the deferred management fee. However, because it's 15 quid for basically what any of us would describe as a pretty good meal, people tend to eat there. And a busy restaurant creates a buzz, and when potential residents walk in, they see the restaurant, they see the restaurant buzzing and the cafe buzzing, and they go, this is exactly the sort of place I want to live. Next slide, please. Okay, hard truth number 6. This is Knight Frank's data regarding deferred management fees across our members. As you can see, higher percentages of deferred management fees are rapidly becoming the norm. Again, this is something that was pioneered in New Zealand and Australia. They're conservatively 25 to 30 years ahead of us. We suspect that this is what the future looks like, but already part of the future is already here. Higher deferred management fees are the key. Next slide, please. I think we will need to admit to ourselves that most people don't know what the hell we're talking about. You know, the care home model is preeminent in the kind of psyche of the UK, whether that's the public mind or the legislative mind. Everybody understands what a care home is. Very few people actually understand what a retirement community integrated with care is, because actually hardly anyone's been to one. And I'm confident in guessing that at least 75, 80%, certainly a high percentage of everyone listening in today have not actually walked around a modern retirement community that's been integrated with care. So overall, the sector is at a hugely exciting period of its kind of evolution, but it is revolutionary in many respects. But it's going to require persistence and political buy-in for us to make this a success. And hopefully everybody on this call today is part of this revolution. So fantastic. That's it from me. Thank you very much. Next slide, please.
Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone, for that, to Lex, Norman, and to Gareth. So we've got about sort of 13 minutes left now to answer some of the questions from the chat box. We've got a few, so I will read out the first one in order, and guys, if you have any more, please do submit them. So first one is from Anonymous. So the question is, care staff recruitment is a challenge across the whole of Scotland, which will also impact upon facilities offering housing with care. Is this an area that the task force is also discussing with the Scottish Government? Probably one for Gareth or Lex.
Sure. Just to clarify the point on the task force, it's not formally convened yet, so it's something that we've had encouraging signs the government is going to be calling for one. So we don't know its exact terms of reference yet. And clearly it does need to be quite broad. And you're right, recruitment is going to be a challenge across the whole of the care sector. One thing that we are encouraged about with the retirement community sector is that our members are in a position where they can invest quite a bit more in terms of the upskilling and training of staff, which simply because the business model hasn't always been the case in some of the adjacent care sectors. So I think it's going to be a challenge across the board, and it definitely should be something that should be looked at by any kind of task force. But I think whilst it's a challenge for everyone, it's perhaps less acute at our end of the scale than it is in some other providers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I might add to that, Andrew, certainly the discussions that we've had with a number of care operators, they're largely domiciliary care operators that we have as our commercial partners who are selling services into some of these retirement communities. The number one reason for staff leaving is the travel. because domiciliary carers obviously are going to, you know, one Acacia Avenue and then one Scotland Road, and that, you know, they're spending a lot of time in the car going between, notwithstanding people who are working in care homes, who generally speaking are poorly paid. One of the joys of the housing with care model is it's centralised. So the best way to think of a modern housing with care scheme is it's a slow motion hotel. And if you talk to any of the staff working in those environments, they actually tend to say, look, it's great. I turn up. It's like, this is my office. It may be a community, but it's a single place. It certainly answers part of the question about retaining care staff in the sector, because it's a nicer place to work in a retirement community than it's whizzing around the countryside or in a care home.
Actually, if I can just come back in off Lex's point there, because he's absolutely right, and there's evidence to suggest that care staff have to spend somewhere between 15 and 20% of their time travelling between appointments, and obviously they want to be spending that time caring for people, and being able to free that time up is both good for them and more efficient for the care system itself.
Fantastic. Okay, so moving on. So we've got another anonymous question. So in your survey, what is the preference from survey participants to live in a retirement community or in a mixed generation community for housing with care? So I can tackle that, and Norman can come in if he has anything else to add. Essentially, the way the survey was set up was to explain a variety of different types of senior housing in Scotland, and to provide a bit of clarity and a definition for what those would entail. One thing I would say is basically it was ranked on a scale of 0 to 10. From memory, retirement communities scored an average of about 7. So the question was along the lines of how likely would you be to consider moving into this type of housing, and that ranked very highly alongside remaining in your own home as long as possible. Norman, do you have anything else to add there?
Yeah, Andrew, I think that's correct. I think there was a very distinct difference, though, between the age groups, so that up to the age of 74, the first choice was staying in mainstream housing with adaptations to your home. Once you reach 75, then retirement villages or retirement communities came out on top. Interestingly, intergenerational housing was lower down the list. But I wonder if, taking up Lex's point, whether there was just simply a lack of knowledge about the products, because although we did describe the characteristics of these different options, if you can't see it and touch it, I'm not sure you really understand it. So I think Lex's point about people not understanding the options that are available is actually quite key here.
Yeah, Norman, absolutely. And I defer to Henry Ford on this, who said, if I'd given my customers what they'd wanted, I would have sold them a faster horse.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed.
All right, muted there. Sorry, moving on. Bear with me 2 seconds. So another question for you, Norman, from Yangzun Shi. Hi, Norman. With elder people moving into senior housing, to what extent do you think will this downsizing effect influence the housing affordability in the market?
Right, so I think that's an interesting question. It probably needs a longer answer than I've got time for here. But currently we've got an inefficient market. We've got seniors living in housing that is too big for their needs. There's too many bedrooms. They don't need that amount of space. But they're finding that the opportunities to downsize and moving to appropriate accommodation is not there. If, in very simple terms, we had a more efficient exchange in the market where people could find the most appropriate house, then I think that would be a good first start. House price interaction, if you like, is a much more complicated question. Would it make housing for the general population more affordable? I think there's a lot of angles to that. But I think if there's more choice and people can move around in the market, we might get a more efficient market. And that, I think, would be a very good first step.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Got a few questions, so I'm going to rattle through them as quickly as we can. Oh, apologies. So we've got a question from Rodney White at Pinson Masons, who says, recognising the emerging opportunity, some years ago Homes for Scotland appointed a PRS champion. Could they be encouraged to do the same for later living, possibly linked to the ARCO task force?
Shall I come in on this one?
Yeah, Gareth, if you want to go.
Yeah. I think it's a really good idea. And whilst the task force that we've been talking about has been Westminster, clearly there is a need for something like this in Scotland as well. Actually, whilst having a team of expert civil servants from across departments collaborating on a task force, actually having a person who understands the sector and is looking to drive it in Scotland would be a fantastic way to really get it off the ground. And I think the potential in Scotland is huge. So actually having someone who has that as their direct remit would be a great way of collaboration both on with the UK task force and making sure that Scotland was not being ignored.
Absolutely. Next question is from Derek Breengan at Virgin Money. He says, I expect the rental model will be well placed in the Scotland demographic and wealth profile. Is the rental model proven and used elsewhere? So I can certainly answer the first part of that question. I completely agree. I think the rental model is well suited to Scotland, especially when you consider the fact that tenants have recently become very well protected in the private rental sector in Scotland, and one of the big issues facing people not wanting to move into rented retirement communities is the fear that they don't have security of tenure, and that goes a long way towards making sure that tenants have rights, and thus will help that model in Scotland. In terms of whether it's proven and used elsewhere, perhaps Gareth or Lex, you'd be better to come in on that.
Well, I can certainly talk about the States, which is a considerably more mature market than the UK. About 90% of all retirement communities integrated with care, again, we're talking about housing with care here, is a rental. So it's people tend to move in a little later. I mean, the average age of an ARCO resident is 82. In our for-profit, and is about 79 or 80 in our not-for-profit members. In the US, it's probably closer to 83, but rental is certainly the most dominant form of tenure in the US. In the UK, we have maybe a slightly unhealthy obsession with property ownership. Who knows which way things are going to go, but there's certainly room, and we've got one of the largest, Birchgrove, for one of our members, are building a pure rental platform in and around sort of London and the home counties, which seems to be going very well. So I think we're just going to see more rental rather than less as we go forward. As my father-in-law put it, who has bought into a retirement community run by one of our members down on the south coast, he said, I'm 86 and I've been sold a 125-year lease. That is insane.
Absolutely. So yeah, getting on, we might have time for maybe two more questions. So Craig Welton asks, although the Scottish Government recognises the need for more housing for older people, the Scottish planning system does not currently translate this need into policy, meaning it is lost within the wider housing need. How do we join the dots so that the planning system helps rather than hinders delivery? Norman, is that one you feel comfortable answering?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I certainly agree with the underlying point here. We have a well understood need. I'm not sure that they're blind to the need for more senior housing. I think they are aware of it. I think a use classes order or some, if you have a large enough scheme, then couldn't we allocate 5-10% to be senior housing? I mean, we do that for affordability. Could we not do that for seniors? So I think it's just a question of lobbying and making sure that we that the Scottish Government and through Andrew and ARCO that people are aware of this sort of mismatch that we're having. There's plenty of there isn't enough house building going on, but there are houses being built, but we're not perhaps tuning the supply side well enough to the demand side. So There's plenty of family housing being built and new starter flats and so on. But is that actually representative of the need going forward? And of course, we've always got to remember that most of the housing stock is already built. What we're doing is adding to the edges. And when we're adding to the edges of the housing stock, we must take into account future demand needs, and the demographics are there in black and white for us. So I think we've just got to continue pressurising and lobbying government to make sure that there is perhaps a use classes order to enable, and also be aware that when you're developing senior housing, of course, the density, you can't pile them high, if you like. The density is greater. There's less density in the retirement sector. So developers may find that they may lose out in terms of profitability if they go for the senior product. So maybe they don't need to contribute so much in Section 75 agreements. So there has to be a balance there. And
sorry to interject. I believe we have reached 10:30. So what we will do, obviously we've got a few questions that we haven't been able to answer. We will send out a follow-up email with our addresses so that you can directly address any questions to anyone who you specifically want to hear an answer from. All that's left to say really is thank you very much to everyone who attended. Thanks to all the speakers today, and we will certainly be looking to do more of these types of webinars in the future, and hopefully one day in the flesh. So thanks a lot.